Our speaker today is Jacob Schlange, who's the Assistant Director for Experiential Learning and Global Initiatives for the University Honors Program. Jacob holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Sciences and International Studies and a Master's of Community and Regional Planning, both from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His thesis proposed an educational framework for equity and inclusion in planning. Prior to coming back to UNL, Jacob served several years living and working in Washington, D.C., first at a public policy think tank, and then in the U.S. Senate. He has worked at UNL since 2015. During his remarks, Jacob will explore the history of redlining and other policies aimed at segregation with a specific focus on Omaha and Lincoln, and discuss how residents of these cities and others continue to feel the financial, educational, environmental, and healthcare effects of those policies today. Please welcome my former student and colleague, Jacob Schlange.
Thank you, Linda. And I already told Al I'm probably going to be walking back and forth in front of the room, so I'm going to grab the mic now. I'm going to be talking to you today about race in the context of American cities. And one of the questions that you may have is, why is Jacob talking about this topic? What does he have to say about it? And so I want to start with a little bit of context. As Linda said, I earned my master's in community and regional planning earlier this year. It was a long process. It took almost 5 years as I was working full-time at the university and taking classes part-time. But during those years, I developed an increasing interest in issues of equity in cities and exploring issues of social justice. And so that was what led to my thesis topic, looking at a framework for teaching about equity in urban planning and in cities. And so I completed that thesis and then leveraged that in my day job with the honors program into teaching an honors seminar for first-year students this fall, all about equity in American cities, called The Great American City: From Injustice to Inclusion. So over the course of this semester, I've had 17 first-year honors students in my class, and we have really done a survey of equity issues in lots of different identities in cities, looking at things like race, but also things like disability and gender and age and many other identities, and the way that different people with different identities interact with the city in different ways. And so I'm going to be sharing part of that course with you today. This topic of race in American cities is one that we spend several weeks on in my class, and I'm going to condense that down into about half an hour, so bear with me. We're going to move quickly. I may have to oversimplify some things for the sake of moving quickly through the process, but I will give some time for questions at the end, and if anyone feels like they're not satisfied with some of the things that I shared, you want to talk a little bit more about it and get more detail, I'm happy to do that after the fact. So I think a good place to start, and this is some place that I start with my students, is helping them unlearn concepts they may have about what the history of the United States looks like. And I think something that I experienced in my educational background was sometimes having this concept in my mind that racism wasn't something that really happened here in Nebraska, that was something that maybe happened in the southern United States, but it wasn't something that we had policies dealing with here in Nebraska or in other parts of the country. And the more that I learned, the more that I realized that that was not the case. And so I think a good place to start is looking at a map like this. This is Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Twin Cities. And the reason that I share this is because the University of Minnesota has done some of the most comprehensive work in exploring the history of racial covenants and mapping them in their cities. So this map is a map that shows all of the racial covenants in the Twin Cities area. And I just show you this as an example of the fact that these racist policies exist all over the country and not just in one region. So racism is not regional. So I'm going to start with this concept of racial covenants. A covenant is, of course, just a clause that's attached to a property deed. And these covenants in particular are limiting the purchase or renting use of the property by a particular group of individuals. This was something that could be undertaken at a neighborhood level, at an individual property level, but the upshot was that it limited who could live in particular areas of a city. And this was something that for a long time in our history was legal. It was affirmed by the Supreme Court as something that was legal, and as a result of it being affirmed by the Supreme Court, you began to see real estate professionals sharing this language all over the country. And you start to see the same language being mirrored in different cities throughout the country. And so here is an example of what that language could look like. I know this is kind of difficult to read, but what I'm particularly focused on here is that last part of the highlighted phrase, talking about the property being occupied exclusively by person or persons other than of the Caucasian race. So this was codified into this deed, and this type of language was repeated again and again throughout the country. Now, obviously, there is a history of race being a limiting factor in where people can live before these racial covenants came into existence. But in the early 1900s, we start to see more of them as a result of the Great Migration, as Black Americans from the South are migrating to other parts of the country, and particularly to the Northeast and Midwest. And in many cities, these racial covenants were a response to that Great Migration. So in 1917, you see the Supreme Court case of Corrigan versus Buckley that, as I said, upheld the right of property owners to do that. They found that in this case, they said a property deed is a legally binding document and it's between two private parties, and so it's something that was allowed to happen. Now, eventually that was overturned in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, but by that time, there were already other processes in place to limit where people could live in American cities. And that's where we get to this topic of redlining, which is really the focus of my presentation today. So redlining starts with the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in the 1930s, drawing up maps of cities across the country. And these maps were intended to indicate which neighborhoods or people who lived in which neighborhoods would be eligible for loans or would be a good candidate for a mortgage loan. And that's where we get the term redlining, is because they were divided up into 4 different categories. The red line was the red lines around a neighborhood indicated that a neighborhood was deemed as hazardous. And there were yellow neighborhoods that were deemed as definitely declining. And blue was slightly better. It was deemed as still desirable. And green was considered to be the best neighborhoods. Now, when we look at these neighborhoods, consistently we see that while the criteria that were used to classify these neighborhoods varied from city to city, consistently they were discriminating against people of color and immigrants and other groups of people as well. So this is just an example of what that map might look like. This is the city of Los Angeles, and you can see the red, the yellow, the blue, and the green spread throughout the city. So I'm going to provide you a little bit more context about this. As we move into the 1930s, we're in the midst of the Great Depression. There's also a housing shortage across the country. And so as part of the New Deal, the Federal Housing Administration is set up to address this issue, and they begin subsidizing production of suburban homes throughout the country. Now, these are primarily available only to white families. And as a result, you see this phenomenon of white flight happening across the country. White families moving from the intersections of cities out to these new suburban developments. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation exacerbated that issue as they developed these maps in 239 cities across the country. Now, one of the things that is really important to emphasize here is that the maps were drawn up by local experts and appraisers in individual cities. So the criterion for which groups were included in the maps in redlined areas varied a little bit across the country. But again, we consistently see a pattern of people of color and immigrant groups and their homes being placed into those redlined areas. So as we look at the map here, we see this was not necessarily a regional issue. It was something that happened all across the country. You do see concentrations of these redlined cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, in part because that is where some of the more populous areas were at the time. But this is something that happened across the country. And this map here, as well as many of the other maps that I'm going to show you today, come from an amazing resource online called Mapping Inequality. This was a project out of the University of Richmond, and they have digitized all of these maps from across the country. And in many cases, they have interactive features on the map so that you can click on individual neighborhoods and see the text about why each neighborhood was designated as it was. Now we're going to talk a little bit later about the fact that for some reason, I don't know the answer to why, for some reason Omaha and Lincoln do not have that interactive feature. They don't have that additional context. So we have to speculate a little bit about why neighborhoods were placed in one category versus another in Omaha and Lincoln. But I think you'll see that we can do a pretty good job of speculating on that. One of the things that's interesting as we look at this map is that you can see the distribution within a city. These colors correspond with the percentage of the city that was designated in each different category. So you'll look at Omaha and see that it's one of the cities with the largest proportion of blue on the map. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about in a little bit. Compared to a city like Sioux City, which we're also going to look at, which is almost entirely red on the graphic that we see here. Now, one of the things that ended up happening as these cities were being redlined across the country was what's called the one house rule. And you may have heard of the one drop rule in relation to race. This was something that referred to the fact that sometimes, if even a single black family lived in a neighborhood, it could negatively impact the rating of that neighborhood. And consistently, throughout the decades that redlining was in place, we see that it is very hard for black families to obtain loans to purchase homes. And in fact, in those 14 years from 1945 to 1959, fewer than 2% of the loans that were given for homes went to black Americans. So I think this is a really interesting example, and this is a point in my class where I would open it up to the floor to talk a little bit about why this map looks the way it does. This is one of the only places in the entire country, in Camden, New Jersey, that you see a redlined neighborhood and a green designated neighborhood side by side. It almost never happens across the country. Now, when we look at this one, we see that though the redlined neighborhood is small, it's directly adjacent to the green neighborhood. So again, in my class, I open this up for discussion and kind of talk about reasons why that might be, and we look at what the students know so far and speculate on why you might see this happening. I'm not going to do that here, in part for the sake of time, but also because I'm smart enough to know that if I turn it over to a room full of faculty, I might not ever get the mic. So we're going to go ahead and just reveal to you that the reason this redlined neighborhood was allowed to exist next to a green neighborhood was because there was a wall there separating these two neighborhoods. And I think that really puts it pretty starkly the reason why these neighborhoods were designated as they were. So one of the things that we do in my class is we spend a lot of time looking at and analyzing these maps. And we specifically look at the language that's used in designating a neighborhood for one category or another. And sometimes you have to do a little decoding. Sometimes they use euphemisms so that they don't say what they really mean. Sometimes they come right out and say what they really mean. But you see language like an infiltration of a certain group of people, or groups of people being described as subversive or undesirable or inharmonious, or lower grade. Now, almost exclusively, when you see words like this, it directly corresponds with a population with more people of color and immigrants. And so, like I said, sometimes we have to read between the lines to determine what this language really meant. Now, this issue is complicated, and as I said, I'm distilling all of this into a matter of about 30 minutes. But one thing that I always want to point out to students when I'm sharing this information with them is that while this issue primarily affected Black Americans, it didn't exclusively affect that group of people. You had people being placed into redlined areas in some cities because they were Catholic or Jewish or immigrants from some other part of the world other than Western and Northern Europe. And as we look at maps from different cities around the country, you can see very specifically which populations were targeted in individual cities. And we actually do an exercise with that in my class, where students have to identify which groups they think are primarily being targeted by these policies. As I said, every city used their own methods for determining the criteria, and they all have their own approach. So that brings us to the Midwest. And I want to start with Sioux City, Iowa, for a couple of reasons. One is that, as I already said, Lincoln and Omaha do not have any information available in a digital format about why neighborhoods were assigned what they were assigned. But Sioux City, Iowa does. You can actually go to the Mapping Inequality website, and you can click on any one of these neighborhoods, and you're going to see a paragraph-long description about why they designated the neighborhood as they did. And one thing you'll notice is there's a lot of red on this map, right? I've shown you here the breakdown by percentage of the land area of the city. And Sioux City has one of the largest percentages of red on the map across the country. 73% of this map is outlined in red. Now, Sioux City is one of the cities that's pretty explicit about the reasons that they are designating their area. So there's a large population of Mexican immigrants, there's a large Black population in some of these neighborhoods, and those are specifically called out as reasons why the neighborhoods were given those designations. Now again, in Omaha we don't have those details, but in some cases we don't really need that in order to figure out what's going on here. Enforced segregation in Omaha predates redlining by many decades. Before redlining even existed, there were neighborhoods there were one specific neighborhood in particular that were designated for Black residents to live. So you'll see it's labeled as a D in North Omaha, so I know it's hard to see on this map, but right up there, before redlining even happened, that neighborhood had already been designated as a space for Black residents. And as new people came to the city during the Great Migration, that's where they were forced to live. And they weren't permitted outside of those boundaries. And we see this history of racial covenants happening during the Great Migration in Omaha, the same way that we saw it happening across the country. So I've provided you with a sampling of some of the neighborhoods in Omaha that had these racial covenants instituted. Now, if you're not familiar with Omaha, you may not recognize all of these names, but one of the things that you're going to notice is that many of these neighborhoods surround the neighborhood that was designated for Black residents. So you see a specific response to people arriving during the Great Migration was they tried to limit where they could move to and expand out of that neighborhood. So this is an example of a protective covenant within the city of Omaha. This is actually one that was on the books in Omaha. And again, I'm just focused on that last portion where they say that this property could not be sold, conveyed, leased, rented, or given to any person or persons of race or blood other than those of the Caucasian or white race. So this was a covenant that was on the books in Omaha. Many covenants across the country, after it was deemed illegal to do this, remain on the books to this day. And so that's been something that many cities are starting to reckon with, is the fact that These were never wiped from the books. They still exist on property deeds in many parts of the country. So this is a map of Omaha in 2010. So it's a little bit more recent. And this is looking at census data about racial distribution of the Omaha population. And I know it's hard to see because I don't have a lot of labels on this map, but you can kind of get a sense from looking at the map. We've got the Missouri River here on the right side to the east, and then we head west from there. You see in North Omaha, the green dots represent the black population. In South Omaha, we have the Hispanic population, and as we head west, we see a lot more of those blue dots, the white population. Now, I always want to provide the caveat on a map like this, that these dots are evenly distributed throughout a census block. So you can't necessarily assume just because you see a dot in a specific place that that represents the exact location of a specific person. But this can still tell us a lot about the racial distribution of the city of Omaha. And it's even more telling when you put the red-lined map on top of it. So I've added here the zones that were designated as red-lined areas. Those are marked with D. There's 3 of them. You can see in North Omaha, that was the predominantly black part of the city. And in South Omaha, we have 2 areas here marked as D, and those are predominantly Hispanic. And you can also look at the areas that were marked in the 1930s as definitely declining, right? That was the area marked C on this map, these yellow areas. And those 2 are primarily Hispanic in the south part of Omaha and occupied by black residents in the north. Because Omaha didn't extend as far west as it does today, our red line map only went as far as 84th Street. But you can see that as Omaha has continued to move westward, that population has continued to be primarily white. So now let's look at Lincoln. Lincoln is admittedly a little bit less of a stark example than Omaha is of this phenomenon, but we can still gather a lot from looking at this map. So you'll see there's not a lot of red on the map. That's the first thing that my students usually notice. There's only 3% of the map that's been designated as red, but Lincoln has a larger than average proportion of neighborhoods that were marked yellow, which again, in most cities meant definitely declining. So over 50% of Lincoln in the 1930s was considered definitely declining. For some context here, because I know this map is hard to read, the gray areas that are in the midst of those colored blotches there are the downtown area and the University of Nebraska, which of course has expanded over time. But immediately to the east of the university is one of our red-lined areas, and then to the northwest, just to the west of the then State Fair grounds, is another one of our red-lined neighborhoods. So Lincoln, too, had these racial covenants in place that restricted where people could live by their race. So the first racial covenant to be instituted was in the Sheridan Boulevard neighborhood in 1916. And they specifically said that only those of the Caucasian race may buy or rent homes in this neighborhood. They did have an exception to that rule in place, which was that if the home employed a staff member who lived in the house who was a person of color, they were permitted to live in the neighborhood, only if they were a staff member. Now there are a couple other neighborhoods that I will point out here. The Piedmont neighborhood had racial clauses introduced in the 1920s, and the Brown Belt neighborhood explicitly limited the sale of property to, quote, Africans, Chinese, or Japanese. So again, we see that these weren't necessarily exclusively targeted at black residents, but predominantly they were. So ultimately, redlining did eventually decline. It was a slow process. It took over a decade once it started. And it started with the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But it was rarely enforced. And so it took a series of different pieces of legislation to ultimately eliminate redlining over the course of the 1970s. Illinois was the first state to explicitly outline it in their state, and other states followed after that. By the end of the 1970s, it was fully illegal. But at that point, it had already had a profound effect on the built environment of our cities. So we spent a couple of days in class talking about the way that this influenced the structure of our cities, the built environment, the infrastructure that we have in our cities. And one of the reasons that redlining has had such a profound effect is because it was used for other things other than determining these the loans and mortgage investment in these neighborhoods. So the interstate highway system was built in part using decisions made based on these HOLC maps. And so after the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 began the construction of the interstate highway system, many of these new interstate highways went right through neighborhoods that had been historically redlined or in some cases yellow-lined. Sometimes this was done very intentionally. Occasionally, it was done because residents of a white neighborhood requested that they have a physical barrier between their neighborhood and another neighborhood. Often it involved the use of eminent domain, and in many cases, these roads were structured in a way that didn't allow the black residents who lived in the neighborhoods that were being cut off to access those roads. There weren't off-ramps placed into those neighborhoods so that they could actually benefit the neighborhood that was being cut off. So because the federal government was providing so much of the funding for these projects, many urban planners saw this as an excuse to solve a couple of what they saw as problems. Robert Moses is a famous example of this in New York City, and you may have heard of the things that he did in New York City. He was a big proponent of this idea of using a highway to remove neighborhoods that he saw as being undesirable. A famous example is the Cross Bronx Expressway that caused the elimination of over 60,000 homes in Bronx. And he famously said that sometimes you need to use a meat cleaver, I think is the term that he used, something, meat knife or meat saw, and he was referring to the use of highways to hack through those neighborhoods. Now, these neighborhoods, because they had been redlined, were in prime positions to have interstates and other highways driven right through them. In part because many of them had begun to stagnate economically as a result of the consequences of redlining. Often that meant the land was cheaper to acquire, so it was cheaper for the city to purchase that land and build a road through it. And many of the residents who lived there did not have the political clout to fight back. So this became such a widespread phenomenon across the country that it coined a term, white roads through black bedrooms. Now this is just one example. Again, this happened all across the country, but one example is from the city of Chicago, where the Dan Ryan Expressway was built in the 1960s, cutting right through Chicago's south and west sides. This displaced over 80,000 people. The vast majority of those were black residents, but it also cut in half the Chinatown that existed there and disproportionately affected recent European immigrants, Hispanic and Asian American residents. So this is, again, just one example of many. But we can look to our own backyard to see this example happening as well. The North Omaha Expressway that goes right through this historically redlined neighborhood in North Omaha was the exact same situation. What you can see today is known as Highway 75. Goes right through that neighborhood. You can see the map as it looked in the 1930s, and this is a snapshot from Google Maps from earlier this year of the way that that road cut right through the neighborhood. Now, they displaced over 2,000 buildings in this neighborhood in the construction of this freeway. That included homes and businesses and churches. And there were other places in Omaha where similar projects were proposed, including through Dundee and through Florence. But in both of those cases, white residents had the political clout needed to put a stop to that project before it started. Now you see similar things happening in Lincoln, although perhaps less pronounced, but I like to share this map with my students of a close-up on some of these red-lined and yellow designated areas in Lincoln. And so you see campus here at the bottom. and many of our major highways and infrastructure that cuts through this downtown and north of downtown area go right through those historically redlined neighborhoods. So this is something that we continue to grapple with today, even though redlining has been illegal for several decades. 3 out of 4 neighborhoods that were redlined continue to struggle economically, and disproportionately those continue to be neighborhoods that are populated by people of color, primarily Black and Latino residents. Homeownership is one of the greatest ways of accumulating wealth in our country, particularly generational wealth that can be passed down from generation to generation. And the people who were left out of these opportunities from the 1930s onwards were in many cases forced into these cycles of poverty that were difficult to break out of. And this is something that, especially in cities in the South and Midwest, continues to be a very pronounced phenomenon. So in my class, we talk about a lot of different effects of redlining and impacts on different areas of life. And I'm just going to breeze through them quickly because I know I'm about done timing-wise. But we look at the environmental impact. We brought in someone who's focused on tree equity to talk to our class about the way that fewer trees in a neighborhood, which is something that we see in redlined neighborhoods, leads to a heat island effect and a higher density of concrete and roads, which allows those neighborhoods to be at a greater risk for floods and other disasters, and really creates a negative environmental impact. We see this in education as well. Funding disparities in neighborhoods because of the way that our education system is funded in the United States and in Nebraska in particular, leading to greater segregation in schools and achievement gaps. Financially, I already mentioned this, the decreased rate of homeownership amongst residents of these neighborhoods and the difficulty accumulating that generational wealth. And the health and well-being impacts. There are a lot of them, especially when you look at things like the heat island effect and how that leads to increased hospitalization due to things like asthma, diabetes, heat stroke. These neighborhoods tend to experience a greater exposure to air pollution and to high traffic. They tend to have less access to healthy, fresh food, and they tend to have a lower life expectancy. My class, throughout the course of the semester, looks at maps examining all of these different outcomes, not just for Lincoln, but for other cities around the country, and observing these phenomena in action. So this is just a closer look at Lincoln by the numbers, and you see this playing out, these things that we've talked about. And all of this data comes directly from the most recent comprehensive plan that the city of Lincoln published, the 2050 plan. So in Lincoln, 64% of white households own their own homes, and you compare that to the much lower rates of Black and Latino households. The median income for white households is anywhere from 15 to 47% higher than other racial outcomes, and it varies depending on the groups that you're looking at, but white households consistently do better than every racial group in Lincoln in that regard. In 2020, people of color made up about 1/5 of the population of Lincoln, but that's projected to grow to about 35% based on historic trends. So this is something that we need to address and we need to grapple with in the city in order to right some of these historical wrongs. And I already mentioned the life expectancy that's impacted. It's really stark in Lincoln. Probably the time in my class when students' jaws dropped the most was when I put up a map of life expectancy in different neighborhoods of Lincoln, and they saw that there was a 20-year difference depending on which neighborhood you might live in. So there is some good news, and this is where I'm going to end. I wanted to end with a little bit of hope. I think that awareness is the first step, and there is an increasing awareness about these issues and a better understanding of our shared history. The Lincoln Comprehensive Plan, 2050 Comprehensive Plan, really does center equity and inclusion as one of its primary goals. And they have consistently, in policies that they've outlined and goals that they have, looked at equity and ways that we can be more equitable as a city. So they're acknowledging that history and identifying a path forward. So that would definitely be a topic for another conversation, but I do need to wrap things up. So I'm happy to open it up for questions with the remaining time that we have, but I'm also going to share my contact info if you'd like to email me if you have other questions or you'd like to learn more about this topic. So with that, I guess I can turn it over for questions. Yeah, sure, in the green there.
You haven't said a single word about the Native American population, either in Lincoln or Nebraska or around the United States.
What was the question?
Yeah, so the question was, we really did not talk about the Native American population in my talk here today. And you're correct, that is a gap here in today's presentation. It's something that we did talk about in my class. For this particular discussion, there's not a lot of data that can be brought in and incorporated into these maps in a way that we can visualize the way we can with some of these other things. So I did choose to omit that population from this discussion, but it is something that we covered in my class in a little bit more detail. Yeah, other questions?
The northeast radial that was some of us, probably most of us, that have been here a while, really, that was debated and canceled. I think Mayor Basalis had something to do with that years and years ago. Whatever happened, wasn't a lot of property condemned on that? Have you worked into that, studied that?
You know, that's not something, so what was the northeast?
Northeast radial.
The northeast radial?
It went right out through the black neighborhood up, and it was controversial to Mayor Basalis, and she ended up, I believe, canceling. Somebody here might be able to correct me if my memory is wrong.
Sure, yeah, so someone may know more about that than I do. The question was about the northeast radial that he said he believes was canceled ultimately, but I haven't done a lot of study on that. Yeah. Someone, though, raised their hand and maybe had, yeah, go ahead.
I know just a little bit about it. The city bought up properties, and then when the radio that they built, the housing authority, I think they're still renting the house.
Okay, so he said the city bought up property with the intention of building the northeast radial, and then when it was not built, the housing authority owned that property and continues to rent it out today.
Now that we have this body of knowledge, what would you like us to do with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. What should we do with it now that we know? I mean, I think one of the first things is share it with others. And obviously I have done a lot of sharing it with others, with my students and with groups like yourself. But I think the other thing is really advocating to the people who make policy that we center equity in our policy decisions as a city. And there are a lot of ways to do that that don't necessarily require extra work or extra money, but just a reframing of the lens through which we're viewing some of the decisions that are being made. So I think advocating to the decision makers who are making these decisions on a planning level, on a policy level, that's the important next step. Awareness is good, but there does need to be advocacy that comes after that. Yeah.
In your study, what have you found about what used to be called T-Town in Lincoln, Nebraska, somewhere between 27th Street and 48th Street, Vine and Holdridge? Very much T-Town.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about that. The question was about T-Town between 27th and 48th Street. And again, someone may be able to share more about that. Yeah.
Okay, T-Town is kind of roughly just east of city campus.
Okay.
And it was called that because T Street was kind of and it was a red line black
Yeah.
neighborhood. And it roughly parallels where they wanted to put the Northeast Radial.
So we're
And
talking
it's
about,
now kind of where the Antelope Valley
yeah, right here.
project has gone through.
Yeah, and you're right. This was a neighborhood that was redlined to the east of campus and was an area that was, in my understanding, predominantly black for many years.
The Beetle Center sits right on top of that now.
Yeah, so the Beetle Center is right there, right there. It sits right on top of it. Yeah, right smack dab in the middle. Yeah.
Do we continue to do effectively the same thing based on history, tradition, wealth, jobs, education, one thing and another.
Yeah, so the question was, do we just continue to do the same thing and kind of wrapped up in different clothing maybe, but it's a really good question and a valid one. We talk a lot in my class, we look at this historical background of redlining, but we also talk about things that continue to happen today. We spend a week talking about the concept of gentrification and the displacement of people as historically disinvested neighborhoods see more investment from developers and what that can lead to. And sometimes the outcome is the same, unfortunately. One of the things that I have to kind of push back against as I have taught my class this semester is I don't want students to leave with this sense that we just keep screwing everything up and there's no hope. I kind of had to do a little bit of a reset in my class after we talked about gentrification because I felt like the students were saying, there's really no hope. If we try and improve a neighborhood, it just leads to gentrification, people get displaced, there's nothing we can do to stop it. So I had to provide some examples of cities that I think are being really intentional, or maybe not always the full city, but neighborhood groups that are being intentional about the way that they are trying to combat gentrification. And one of my favorite examples, now as a city, Washington, D.C. is seeing a lot of gentrification, and corporations like Amazon, as they're building their headquarters, are really driving that increasingly. My wife and I both lived in Washington, D.C. for several years, so it's interesting to go back and see a city that we barely recognize in some neighborhoods now. But there are some examples of positive things in the city, and I shared the example of the 11th Street Bridge, which is a new park that is being developed between Capitol Hill and the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And it's been a very slow process, in part because they're being very intentional about providing support to the neighborhood to combat gentrification. So that was a long-winded answer to your question to say that in some ways we do continue to do these same things, negatively affecting the same groups of people, but I think there are places, and sometimes it's at a very hyper-local level, there are places where organizations are doing a really positive job of preventing some of those things. Yeah,
I just want to add that the city of Lincoln has adopted some policies with that intentionality in the south of downtown neighborhood as they continue to develop south of downtown.
Yeah, absolutely. So Linda pointed out the south of downtown neighborhood of Lincoln and the way that that's continuing to be developed. And there's been a lot of thought that has been put into trying to develop in a way that does not displace the residents that currently live in that neighborhood. So that's another local example.
Have you interviewed realtors who daily who are selling the properties around to what's really happening? Have you been able to interview these people?
The question was, have I been able to interview realtors about this phenomenon? To be honest, I really haven't had a lot of those conversations. I would be interested in that perspective, especially on sort of the historical foundations of this, but it's not a conversation that I've had.
Okay.
Yeah. I saw another question back here.
Yeah, I always understood that one of the good things that Lincoln did, and we've lived here since '73, was that it expanded the boundaries of the city to encompass any resident or other areas that might have become suburbs, so that the economic value of that wealth would be available for all of the schools throughout the city. And that would sort of mitigate a little bit the damaging effects of redlining. At least that's a rationale that I had always been told.
Yeah, so a couple of things that he mentioned there. One of the things that I talk about with my class, and that I ended up cutting the slide from today's presentation, again, for the sake of time, but comparing Lincoln and Omaha a little bit. And there's a couple of things that are different in those cities that have led to disparate outcomes. So one of the things you mentioned was the annexation of land around the outside of Lincoln. Omaha, well, I should say Nebraska has some of the most aggressive annexation policies in the country. And Omaha in particular, because of its unique status in the state and its classification in state policy, has an extremely aggressive annexation power. Lincoln, as you said, because of the way that it has approached its long-term planning, has been able to avoid some of the things that are happening in Omaha, which is that as new SIDs, sanitary improvement districts, continue to be added in Omaha and then later annexed in, that's increasing the wealth disparity, because there's no policy that requires affordable housing in SIDs as they're being built, and so you end up seeing that greater wealth disparity in part exacerbated in a place like Omaha. And the other thing you mentioned was school districts, and that is something that we see very differently between Omaha and Lincoln. As you all know, we have one public school district for the entire city of Lincoln, as opposed to the multiple different school districts that we see in Omaha. And we spend some time in my class, we spend a lesson looking at some of those education disparities and the way that school districts that are right next to each other can have dramatically different outcomes and achievement gaps and funding resources. And this is not just an urban issue either. One of the examples that we look at in my class from a rural standpoint, because it's gotten some national coverage, is the boundary between the David City Public School District and the Schuyler Public School District. These two school districts border each other. They have very similar size of population, but the outcomes are dramatically different. And one of the biggest differences between these two school districts is that Schuyler is over 85% students of color, primarily Hispanic students, and David City is about the same proportion white students. So dramatically different outcomes in these two cities that are right next to each other. And there's a lot more complicating factors than that, obviously, but this is something that's not just an urban issue. All right, well, before I hand back the mic, I just want to say thank you for letting me come and share what I've learned about this topic, and I hope that you've at least taken something away from it, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. I'll throw my email address back up on the screen really quick before I hand the microphone off.